Quality Committee. This morning we're going to start with an oversight hearing, which we've entitled California's Drinking Water Program, Recent Progress and Ongoing Challenges. We will then convene the legislative hearing. In 2012, California became the first state to enact a law declaring a human right for safe, clean, affordable, and accessible drinking water. In July of 2014, after review by the Brown administration, stakeholder input, and legislative action, the state's drinking water program was transferred from the California Department of Public Health to the State Water Resource Board in an effort to better achieve this important task. This reorganization combined the Water Board's resources, expertise, and focus on water supply with the Drinking Waters program's focus on water quality and public health. Now, almost 2 years later, today's hearing provides us with an opportunity to review the Water Board progress on the reorganization and how the Water Board has met its mandate pursuant to the transfer, and what challenges and gaps have been identified since transferring the program. For our first panel, we have from the Water Board the Executive Director and the Deputy Director of the Division of Drinking Water, who will discuss the program transfer. Our second panel will then provide stakeholder perspectives on the drinking water program. The Association of California Water Systems represents the state's regulated water systems, and Clean Water Action will provide an environmental justice perspective. With that, I'd like to welcome the first panel. We have Tom Howard, who's the Executive Director of the State Water Resources Control Board, and Cindy Forbes, the Deputy Director for the Division of Drinking Water at the State Water Board. Good morning. I've had a chance to read through the tome that staff has provided me that was released on Safe Drinking Water Plan for California, and my congratulations. Can I say it's a good read? It was a good read, informative, but please.
It's a fascinating read. I encourage everyone to read it, especially when they're getting ready to go to sleep. So anyway, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to come here. The topics I wanted to cover are, very briefly, the reason for the transfer. I was going to mention a little about the history, but you've already covered that, Senator. I was going to talk about the basics of the transfer, the statutory mandates that the Water Board is trying to comply with or is complying with, and then very briefly the challenges. So why did people think that this was a good idea? I mean, I think ultimately the reason is there was a perception, and a perception that I believe is reality, that we could be more, we could improve the effectiveness and efficiency of both the Water Board and the Drinking Water Program by melding their functions. Essentially, what happened is that, or what the belief was, is that a single agency in charge of all water-related activities had the potential for the whole to be greater than the sum of the parts. And I think that is true, and I think that we're going to try to cover some of the reasons why we believe that's true in the next few minutes, and I hope we are convincing to you. So what about the basics of the transfer? Once it became clear that this transfer was going to occur, and the Water Board in the beginning of 2014 put together the first thing I did was at the suggestion of my Deputy Director for Financial Assistance, she suggested that what I needed more than anything was a director of transitions, and that she was just the right person for the job. And it was one of my better ideas because I think it worked out very, very well. The director of transitions, who retired after finishing this work, and now is a retired annuitant with us, is here in the audience, Liz Haven, and she was really one of the driving forces behind making this a successful transfer. What we did is we formed a whole series of work groups that consisted of equal numbers approximately of DPH staff and of State Water Board staff to cover essentially all the particulars of the transition. And the idea was to try to make sure when July 1 rolled around that the transition was seamless. We also had an external task force that had been appointed by the Secretaries of Health and Human Services and by Cali, PA, and we were working closely with them, running ideas past them and things of that nature and taking suggestions from them. We also had from the governor's office a representative, David Rex, who was very helpful in terms of greasing things with the administration. So we really had a team in place that was really, that I think was pretty assured, would assure us of success. So in March of 2014, we put together, released a transition plan. And I like to think that what we had in the transition plan, I think of it in terms of sort of 5 buckets of activities. One is the core regulatory program of the drinking water program. The second was the environmental laboratory accreditation program. The third was the all of our funding programs. Next was administration and IT, and then lastly, we had an operator certification program. So those were, at least the way I broke it up, the way I was thinking of the 5 functions that we needed to integrate as much as possible into the water board. And the first one I talk about is the regulatory programs and the environmental lab accreditation program. One thing we heard very clearly from our stakeholders was there's nothing broken in the regulatory program, that it's working well, and what we should do is make sure we do no harm. And so we took that to heart. We established, out of the core regulatory program, the Division of Drinking Water at the State Water Resources Control Board, and I hired the first deputy director for the Division of Drinking Water, and that is Cindy Forbes, who's here with me. And she's a woman who had her whole career experience in the drinking water program, and that's certainly what I needed because I had no experience in the drinking water program. So that formed a separate division. We also put the environmental lab accreditation program in that division, and that particular program has some issues, but I wanted to start talking about these various categories by having Cindy, who's in charge of these 2 programs, run through her experience during the transition. Then I'll come back and talk about a couple of more programs.
Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you, especially about what I do only. I'm a one-trick pony. I do drinking water, and I've got some recycled water experience. But one of the beauties of coming to the board is it offered an opportunity for the drinking water program for the first time ever to interface with a lot of other divisions that we knew existed at the state board, but we had really never had any direct dealings. Probably the most important one was the Division of Water Rights, which after 4 consecutive years of drought, we found many water systems impacted by the drought, so we interfaced very carefully with some of our sister divisions. When it comes to the core regulatory program, we are delegated primacy from US EPA, so we have responsibilities to keep the program. It includes permitting of water systems, which is something that is California specific, and it's important because when we permit a water system, we identify their sources that they're able to use and the treatment that has to be provided. That's very important in light of the Flint situation because those requirements were not part of the Michigan DEQ's oversight program. The next thing that we do as part of our federal oversight is we have to conduct sanitary surveys. That's the federal term. The most easy way to remember it is inspections. So our staff are out reviewing all the system facilities, reviewing the treatment, identifying whether or not a system has acceptable source capacity, whether they're meeting drinking water standards, when they're not meeting drinking water standards. We work with them to secure either new treatment, to correct the problem, or secure new sources. So that's when we interface with the Division of Financial Assistance, is to make sure we return systems to compliance. The other thing we are responsible for doing is adopting all the federal drinking water standards, and that was part of the program that wasn't really running on all 8 cylinders. We did not have sufficient staffing. We needed to put more people in the regulations development unit. We've been able to do that once we got to the board. So we are currently adopting the revised total coliform rule, which the federal standard was effective on April 1st. We have revisions to the lead and copper rule that we are planning to undertake. And then in case you weren't aware of it, California has the most stringent drinking water standards that exist in the country. So we have maximum contaminant levels for a number of constituents that the federal government has not yet chosen to regulate. Another thing that was in my division that we did, as Tom pointed out, was not in the greatest of shape when we came over was the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program. And that's a very important program because its responsibility is to make sure that laboratories that are conducting environmental analysis, not just for drinking water, but for toxics, for the wastewater industry, that the data they generate is accurate and we make decisions based on good data. The first thing we did was we hired a panel of experts to come in and take a look at that program. They came up with a work plan. We have a 3-year work plan, and we are determined we are going to make sure that program is clicking on all cylinders within the next few years. Another thing that the drinking water program has as part of our responsibility is we are emergency responders, and that was a critical issue as part of the transition. Was were we going to lose touch with our public health partners that were at the Department of Public Health? 6 weeks after the program moved, we had the Napa earthquake. The city of Napa experienced more than 120 water main breaks. We had boil water orders everywhere. Staff were on site on a Saturday morning responding to that. And we worked doing damage assessments and returning the system to compliance. And then last September, we had the Canyon Fire, which impacted 36 water systems, over 2,000 structures burned. And we had folks in there evaluating the water systems as soon as that happened. Whenever there are unsafe water alerts or boil water orders, we have in place the communication back to the Department of Public Health so that both the licensing and certification folks, those are the people who take care of all the healthcare facilities, that they know there are water problems, and also with Food and Drug Branch. So there's no packaging of food with unsafe water. Probably the other biggest remaining challenges for the Division of Drinking Water involves this drought and whether or not water availability and water quality is going to improve. We still have a number of water systems that are unable to return to compliance because, frankly, they're just too small and they don't have the ability with their small customer rate base to be able to afford the O&M of the treatment if it's installed to solve their problem. So that's our remaining challenges, are these systems that are inherently too small, too isolated to be able to utilize another significant authority that was given to us when we got to the Water Board, which was consolidation authority. We can now, when it makes sense, when two systems are close enough together and one is chronically failing drinking water standards, we can require the nearby system that has sufficient resources and meets drinking water standards to serve the smaller water system. And that's been a huge bit of progress because it makes no sense to try to leave small systems that are never going to be viable to remain operating on their own.
On that point, do you feel that you have the ability to thread smaller systems together? And I'm thinking, taking your example, here's a system that's working, here's a system that's not, and force the consolidation. You know, the public might not appreciate the 7,600 water districts that public water districts that exist in California, which just for the average bloke like the senator from Fremont is saying, oh my God, really? We really need 7,600 systems when they're failing. They're not performing. Is it possible that you have failing system, and then performing system, and then and the consolidation would be to thread the two failing systems into the system? Do you feel you have that authority?
We have that authority, but I think we're going to be very strategic and surgical in making sure we don't step on the toes of the LAFCOs, and we want to make sure that we don't result in what would be considered urban sprawl, so that you now have potable water lines that run through prime irrigation land. But certainly that is the path forward. I think if you look at most of the urban areas, unfortunately, their service areas have dots around them of separately operated public water systems. And you've hit upon the key problem that currently exists, and it's the legacy of small water systems that should have been incorporated into something else, but they were allowed to operate independently.
I don't lose any sleep with that Billy Bob's grandfather set up a water system, and they feel they have a right. And when we have a mandate, at least we've made the human right mandate that people deserve safe drinking water. If we have to step on some toes, you know, that's, be it as it is. This is the 21st century, and I think that we've been lackadaisical, and I think part of the initial work that you've done on this reorg is fantastic. I mean, just setting it up and identifying that. And if you need legislative help, please let us know, because it's small systems are not providing safe drinking water. They're charging the users more. They lack the technical, the maintenance, the financial wherewithal to do it. But we don't want, LAFCO may be bent out of shape if we suggest that we consolidate these, and that's, you know, that may be a public hearing, an uncomfortable public hearing that we need to have. But you know, we have a charge here. I'm sitting here, you guys are sitting there. We have our charges of what we're supposed to be doing in order to deliver to the public a safe product.
Yeah, I did want to imply that LAFCO hasn't been very cooperative. Actually, we've had terrific relationships, and while we have only issued 2 mandatory consolidation orders, we have lots of voluntary consolidations that we are working with LAFCOs and various communities to secure, and it's been very acceptable.
If there are incentives that you think that the legislature should consider in order to move the agenda forward, because again, at the end, there's I'm not going to lose any sleep if I wake up in a couple of years and we have 3,800 water districts instead of 7,600 water districts. I think people are going to say still they really need 3,800 districts. But be that as it is, if there's some incentives, because it seems to me if we don't have performance standards, is the typical gear that we use, is we say, here's the performance standard. You don't make it, you're gone. That's it. That's it. Please continue.
Mr. Chair, what causes you to lose sleep?
Well, we'll touch on that later. No.
Are you done?
I think I'm done.
Okay.
I'll just answer questions.
So I wanted to cover those. Oh, and we agree completely, by the way, that consolidation is the preferable approach for a lot of small systems. I mean, you know, they just don't have the economies of scale. And I do think there are some opportunities potentially that haven't been reached yet, and we'd be happy to spend some time talking to your staff about some approaches that might be helpful in the future in order to effectuate more consolidations. I wanted to talk about the 3 remaining buckets. First, funding. Just to give you a sense of the size of the, the relative size of the division versus the total amount that came over, we had about 2/3 of the staff and were moved into the new division of drinking water, but about 1/3 of the staff was integrated into existing divisions at the State Water Resources Control Board. And the biggest chunk of those people were the people who were working on funding programs. You know, fundamentally, we had a slightly different approach. We've had a slightly different approach than what Division of Drinking Water has in terms of their funding programs. We, a number of years ago, completely separated out all of our sticks and carrots and said, we'll have a completely separate funding program. It's centered in our Division of Financial Assistance, and all of our financial assistance tools would be put into that program. And, basically, it's trying to manage these funding programs and get projects from start to finish and all of the complexities of that. It's very difficult to be both a regulator and a person who's managing these financial assistance programs. So at one time, we had sort of meshed these functions together. We separated them. The Department of Public Health had them sort of meshed together in part. So we separated them completely and put all of the folks who, or at least all the PYs that we needed or that were assigned to do financial assistance programs into our Division of Financial Assistance. We also worked to align the way we went about doing our business. The Department of Public Health had a very lengthy set of regulations that some people perceived were actually causing them to slow down in moving forward with projects. And as part of the transition, we had trailer bill language that allowed us to use a much more streamlined approach in terms of establishing the rules for funding opportunities. We moved to what we have been using in the drinking water or in the Clean Water Program a long time, which are basically adoption by our board in a public forum of annual guidelines saying what the priorities would be and how we would manage our resources. And so in 6 months after the transfer, we had adopted a similar set of guidelines for the Safe Drinking Water Program, and all of the regulations that were a big portion of the regulations that they had regarding funding were sunsetted, and that was through legislative approval. We also streamlined the application process. We sort of like the idea of what we call one-stop shopping. Someone comes in, they tell us what their problems are, and then we look at all of our funding sources and try to put together a package that will address their needs. It might be, depending on their financial abilities, some different mix of bonds or grants and loans. And so rather than ask people to apply for a loan or a grant or whatever, we just ask them to come in and tell us what they need.
When the drinking water program was in public health, they didn't have that coordination.
Well, my understanding is no, and in fact, we didn't really have it either until about 2 or 3 years ago. We changed our procedures. People would come in and they'd say, well, if you want Prop 84 money, you got to put in an application for Prop 84. If you want state revolving fund, you need this, and we'd have all these various pots, and people would have to come in and figure out which pot was the one they wanted to apply for. And so, but none of that really made sense. We just said, we really need to do this in a very streamlined fashion and provide service to people, especially the smaller communities that we've also we've also used our cleanup and abatement account money, which is within the Division of Financial Assistance, we've really changed the focus of it and put it really mostly, or a large portion of it, on emergency drinking water supplies. In the last year or two, we've obviously that's happened through appropriation, but we were doing that anyway. And I think we've funded 151 emergency drinking water projects since out of our cleanup and abatement penalty monies since the drinking water program came over. We formed an Office of Sustainable Water Solutions that was mandated by the legislature, and that is a group that provides technical and financial assistance exclusively for small disadvantaged communities, and they work both on the wastewater side and on the drinking water side, try to have a focus and reach out to those parties. We also responded to US EPA's non-compliance letter on the Department of Public Health's drinking water program. The US EPA had said that the capitalization grant wasn't being adequately utilized, and so they sent them this letter of non-compliance threatening their future capitalization grants. They asked for 29 actions to be taken. Ultimately, at this point, we have finished 28 of them ahead of schedule. And we are unfortunately 6 months behind on one of them, but we are conversing with US EPA, and we will meet the final deadline, unfortunately 6 months late, but still I feel pretty good about 28 ahead of schedule. The best one, or the biggest one, is the unliquidated obligations was very large, and we were required to bring it down to a much smaller level in 18 months, and we've exceeded what US EPA set as our target for the unliquidated obligations. I think most importantly, though, when you look at the funding, what has been the absolute best outcome of all of this is that, you know, when we approach a small community or even large communities, you know, it's no longer, well, if you want something for your drinking water system, you know, go over there, and if you want something for your wastewater system, go over there. Now it's come and tell us what water problems you want to solve in your community. It doesn't matter if it's drinking water or wastewater, and we will try to put together a finance package that works for you. And so it's just a lot simpler, I think, for the people to look when they look at the full range of activities. Just two other things I wanted to mention quickly that were two more buckets of activities. One is admin and IT. Our main interest was just making sure that it was seamless, that people didn't have any IT issues or administration issues. We took the staff that came from Department of Public Health and we put them into our Division of Administrative Services or our Division of Information Technology. And I think that from what I hear from the drinking water program staff, they're very pleased with the service they've received. And lastly, an operator certification program. This is a certification program that the Water Board used to have or still has for wastewater operators, and the drinking water program had one for drinking water system operators, and we've combined them, and I think we are a lot more efficient in meeting both of the needs of the operators of both categories because we actually can move people back and forth as the workload needs and occur, and I think it's been, and there's a lot of synergies there that we take advantage of.
I can't believe I'm asking this. Your SDWIS program, the data, you moved from public health had the PICME system.
Yes.
You guys have moved with the US EPA system. This is a year old or almost a year old report. You guys were in the second phase. There were 3 phases of data or IT integration. Can you update us since I have you here?
Well, yeah, PICME was an acronym that was created in the early 90s, and it also reflected the legacy database that the drinking water program used. PICME stood for permits, inspections, compliance, monitoring, and enforcement, and it represented the 5 significant tasks that the drinking water staff were doing, and it was a mainframe-based application. When we got to the board, the IT folks over there were amazing. Yeah, and so they created a replacement database for us, and we've now transitioned into what's called CIDWIS State. It's the Safe Drinking Water Information System, and that's the federal system. We still have some data challenges, but all in all, since we've been at the board, we've really addressed a number of the key data system issues that existed when we were at the Department of Public Health. I mean, we were using systems that had been created primarily by the staff engineers in the early 90s because we were using paper and pencils and tracking things by hand.
Yeah, it just seems like there's, as you read it, there's a mountain full of data that you're now going to try to put into this CIDWIS. But then when you get to the third phase, you're going to do the analyticals. You're going to be able to determine the non-compliance that folks have, which is really, you know, that seems to be the treasure trove, right? Where you look at these different, not just in your safe drinking water, but in the agricultural waters, the whole water delivery system, all this data is going to be together. So it's, good luck with that.
I agree. I mean, it remains our biggest challenge, but I've met this week with the IT folks, and we have a path forward, and I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll get geospatial information soon so that when people drill in, they can see where the water quality is in each community.
Excellent.
So the last thing I wanted to cover is the question of challenges. Cindy, I think, mentioned this, but I'll go into a little more detail. And really, the number one is the human right to water, and how do we make that a reality? You mentioned consolidation, and yes, I think we should have a further discussion on improvements that can be made in the consolidation legislation, and that is the number one way to get a sustainable water supply to people, is to have them connected to, a system that has the economies of scale and the technical and managerial and financial ability to actually manage. Most of these smaller communities don't have that capability, and they're just one bad day away from a failing water system. And so even though they might be operating today fine, tomorrow the well fails, and now we're all into running around on an emergency basis, and there are many of these types of systems. But we also have a lot of technical and financial tools to address this, but we really don't have all the tools we need from the financial. And obviously there was bond money that was available, and there's state revolving fund loan money. But that really only deals with capital expenditures. And over the lifetime of a project, capital expenditures are generally somewhere between 10 to 25% of the total cost of the project. The other 75 to 90% of the cost of the project is operation and maintenance over the lifetime of the project. And there's no resources available for the smaller communities to deal with this operation and maintenance issue. And it's an insurmountable problem for a number of communities unless we get some help to them. So we've put together a framework. We put it together last fall. I believe you folks have seen it. Certainly we'll get you copies of it if you haven't. But it calls for 3 general categories of activities. One is, again, the aggressive existing use of, in an aggressive way, of our existing sources of funding, including things like polluter pays, which we are actually doing and getting some communities water under that category. We also, also all of our grants, loans, everything else, just how do we focus our money on the areas where it really requires, some action. The second is to eliminate the proliferation of new systems. As Cindy said, the problem we have is that there was a lot of bad planning in the past. And how do we stop the bleeding from, going into the future?
I think we're going to get to an idea in a couple of minutes.
I know you are, and I was going to acknowledge that. And then lastly is targeted assistance to small communities. And one of the things we're looking at, besides obviously the consolidation and the financial and technical capacity, is a grouped management contract. The idea is to try to get some sort of virtual consolidation if you can't get actual physical consolidation. That is not going to solve the problem, but it does give people potentially in these smallest communities the financial and management capability to maintain their systems at a lower cost than if they're trying to do it by themselves. But even with that, I think that that type of grouped contract approach will only work if there is some money that's coming in to subsidize it for operation and maintenance. Obviously, the people who have the system will still have to pay water bills, but they aren't going to be able to cover, even under a group management contract, the actual cost of delivery of water. And I'd like to acknowledge a couple of bills, Senate Bill 1263 and 1262, which are co-authored by the chair and Senator Pavley, and they address some of the issues that I just identified, and we're very hopeful that they'll be adopted. And just one last thing I'd like to mention, and that's private systems. We only regulate systems of 15 and up, and there are a lot of private wells of less than 15. And so while it is not our direct responsibility under statute, I do feel a sense of responsibility for these systems, since we are meant to provide the human right to water extends to everyone, not just to people living in communities of 15 connections. And so, we are trying or looking at source control issues and polluter pay issues and things of that nature that might be helpful. And of course, we're always interested in ideas of how we can address these problems more effectively. But that is a challenge that I think, although not within our direct responsibility, is something that we feel we should be trying to make some progress on. And those were all the comments I had. Thank you.
Members, have any questions of our first panel? No. Very good. Thank you for coming, and thank you for bringing us up to date.
Mr. Chair, if I just could, it just is so exciting to hear the great report after the conversations we had a couple of years ago in this room,
Yeah.
and the opposition to the move and the change that was forthcoming. So I'm just really excited, and it's one of those great examples of government working in the right way. And when you see a problem, we kind of address it and try to make those changes that are necessary to provide, especially in this case, healthy and safe drinking water to our citizens. So
You know,
thank you for holding this hearing.
the-
And thank you for the great work that the Water Board's been doing.
In Australia, in the state of Victoria, the Melbourne Emergency Services, they've adopted a motto that, 4 simple words, we work as one. And I couldn't help but think about that when we're talking about the role that the State Water Resource Board serves as an emergency service, and to say, hey, forget about the silos that we're all familiar with, and that whatever you are in government, and just say, we're working as one. We work as one on this. Let's solve the problem and forget, those jurisdictional limits. So it's uplifting.